Over the course of writing Military Culture Shift, and especially present in the last 3 episodes, the phrase moral injury has come up again and again. Brought into mainstream awareness by Jonathan Shea in the 90s and early 2000s, his first book, Achilles in Vietnam: Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character, introduced moral injury as a distinct second syndrome from PTSD. As progress continues to evolve on the individualized treatment modalities for PTSD and moral injury, the Afghanistan exit and its eerily similar characteristics with Vietnam brings up the question of how does an entire culture heal when it feels betrayed and morally injured? Surely the Afghanistan veterans and families that came out of 2 decades of war are not destined to carry similar burdens as our recent Vietnam veterans have. I asked our good friend and mentor, Dr. Timothy Mallard, chaplain and assistant professor and director of ethical development at the United States Army War College and subject matter expert on moral injury, to sit down with me just 60 days out from his own retirement. Still on his own journey of healing from his response to the 9/11 attack at the Pentagon, he has been a pillar of strength, wisdom, and comfort for many over the last several decades. I'm Corie Weathers. You're listening to Military Culture Shift, a limited series podcast on the impact of war, money, and generational perspective on morale, retention, and leadership. With me, I have Dr. Chaplain Timothy Mallard. Is there any other titles I'm forgetting there?
Well, some of my British colleagues, asked, should we call you Reverend, Dr. Chaplain, Colonel? No, just call me Timothy.
So many. No. Also, just so honored to call you friend too. And so
absolutely.
I wanted to bring you on because, and I'm going to let you describe all that you are learning and teaching and have studied over the years. But as I was doing these interviews and talking about everyone's story of especially the 2 decades of war, wrapping up with Afghanistan withdrawal, this theme of moral injury, soul injury has come up so many times. And you and I were talking about before we hit record, just how even just these words of betrayal play a part in moral injury as well. And so I knew as moral injury kind of kept coming up in the conversations, you are, in my eyes and in many other people's eyes, a leading expert in moral injury.
Thank you.
And have studied it and spent a lot of your career focusing on it. And so I'm so excited to have you share a little bit of what you're continuing to learn and how you are tending to the community and serving them. Full transparency, you and your wife, Sharon, are wonderful mentors to Matt and I and have been for a long time. And
thank you.
Grateful to call you guys friends. And I am, if our audio sounds a little bit different, I'm here at the Army War College with you in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Where you are teaching as well. Right. So why don't you share a little bit about just what led you into studying moral injury? I know you're about to retire, but you have served how many years now, did you say?
Over 36, almost 37 years.
36 years. Yeah. Everybody else listening to that right now is either very tired on your behalf or how in the world did you do that? So share a little bit about your story.
Okay. Well, again, in full disclosure, that my story in one sense is predicated around the fact that I experienced moral injury. I didn't know it at that time, not only earlier in my career, but as the son of an Army chaplain. So when I retired this summer, somebody helpfully pointed out that I will leave from that basically 55 years of association with the United States Army as a dependent all the way through my father's 30-year career and his retirement, and then my own career. I began to experience this with my father when he came home from Vietnam. He was a chaplain his entire career, and he was a battalion chaplain in the 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam for a year in 2 units that saw very, very hard combat. And I didn't know as a young child what I was witnessing in him was both later diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, but as he and I grew in our relationship, even as adults, this profound sense of moral injury, right? So then I went into the military, and after my deployments to Saudi Arabia in 1991, and then Bosnia, the Pentagon, Iraq, Afghanistan. I also began to really experience the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I tell people that. I don't mind telling people I've been diagnosed with that. But again, like my father, this differentiation, going back to the original literature by Jonathan Shea, Rita Nakashimi-Brock, others, including Shira Magan and Brett Litz, there was a distinction between the 5 diagnosable criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. Mm-hmm. And now Shea, when he was dealing with Vietnam veterans in the mid to late 1970s, and then later wrote about this, in his taxonomy, he described moral injury around the noun of betrayal. And he applied that to the military as a moral formation, that this betrayal was profound. And he had 3 kind of qualifiers on that. Later, again, Shira Magan, Brett Litz, others would change the noun to transgression, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought that there was a difference, and they expanded the application beyond the military context, right? Which was important. But personally, how I came to this was after I came home from my first deployment to Iraq, which was also after the Pentagon and also after Afghanistan. My family began to notice changes in me that I could not see myself. So in one sense, they became like a type of mirror to me where I could see myself in my own woundedness. And so I went through counseling therapy, even as a chaplain, right? I did that because I had many of the classic symptoms of PTSD, disturbed sleep patterns, dreams. I mean, at times intrusive memories that would come at times I didn't want them to come into my mind, that sort of thing. And yet there was something different. There was something else that was really gnawing at me, and I couldn't really figure out what it was until I began to study this concept of moral injury. And whether you use Shea's taxonomy of betrayal, like I'm doing more recently, or the other noun of transgression, it's a sense that some sort of interior boundary has been crossed within you. And now, last year, one of my students here at the War College very helpfully, and he was frustrated one day. This happens in, I hope, in good, pedagogical work. He got sort of frustrated, and he finally just kind of blurted out, "Okay, chaplain, I got it. But what's the boundary that's crossed?" And he wanted me to define the boundary for him, and I said, "Only you can define that boundary for you. That boundary, whatever it is, that's crossed, a deeply held moral conviction or belief, is going to be very, very particularized to the person, to each person. In fact, 2 soldiers might go through the exact same set of experiences, and one is completely unmoved by it, doesn't feel any type of, moral disconsonance there, while another is profoundly affected by it and feels as if some kind of interior boundary has been crossed." And so one of the things I've been working on is this concept of boundary crossing and asking people to ask themselves, well, what are the values, principles, attitudes, and beliefs that I hold? And if they are that profoundly shaping for me, is that the boundary that's been crossed?
So it does. And this is an interesting, for those who maybe have not studied about moral injury as much as you have, I would guess and make the assumption that most people hear moral injury and say, moral injury happens when you're asked to do something that's against your beliefs, your values, your morals, almost as if it's like this external action or this behavior, this task that was given to me that goes against.
Right. It could be where you are asked to do something that violates a core value, principle, attitude, or belief. That could be the boundary, right? But in terms of moral injury, and again, many of the other able scholars that have been working in this have identified, it may not be something you are asked to do. It could be something you failed to do, that you told yourself, I should do this. I should reach out and give a $10 bill to that guy on the street because my faith teaches me that I should care for the poor, and I bypass him. right? So I'm the one who has failed to act on my own value, principle, attitude, or belief. You could be asked by another to violate something like that, or it could be something you witnessed that violated that type of belief, right? For instance, if I in combat watch, unfortunately, a child being killed, maybe inadvertently, they get caught in a crossfire. Soldiers are trying to engage legitimate combatants, but somehow a child gets caught in the crossfire and dies, right? That it may not affect this soldier to my right or this soldier to my left, but perhaps I have a value that children should not die in war. I may not have ever even thought of it at the cognitive level or at the intellectual level in that term, but somehow it profoundly impacts me, right? So that forces me to look inside myself and ask, what is the boundary that's crossed, right? And have I crossed it, or has somebody else crossed it, or have I failed to cross it when I should have, right? I've created my own moral injury by something I failed to do. It could be any of those.
This is so important because I think this goes back to your story. For clarity, you responded to the Pentagon,
right,
when during 9/11,
right.
And so that was a big part of the trauma in your story, not the only trauma, but a big one, right? So when you mention the Pentagon, you're specifically mentioning 9/11. And so I think that this goes back to your story and probably resonates with a lot of people who, when moral injury first came on the scene and became part of the conversation, maybe they, like you, had a diagnosis of PTSD, but just didn't feel like they weren't healing well. Something wasn't being tended to. And what I hear you saying is there is perhaps more people who might be experiencing a level of moral injury than people realize. And it could be that the missing thing that needs to be incorporated in their healing and in their process moving forward to be able to think through and ask some of these questions.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll give you a personal example, right? I don't mind talking about this in terms of my service at the Pentagon. We've been out there several days, and the building had been stabilized, and we were working on the teams that were taking out bodies, right? And I had seen a particularly horrific scene, and I came out of the building and I went and I sat down next to a civilian firefighter. I was supporting a FEMA search and rescue team. By the way, just some of the greatest Americans I've ever worked with. Tennessee Task Force 1 from Shelby County, Tennessee. And one of those firefighters, a man who had long experience in firefighting, right? I went and sat down next to him, and he asked me, he says, "Chaps," he said, "you look like something's wrong." And so I told him, "Well, I've just seen something." And I described it. I won't describe it for your listening audience. And I was profoundly shaken by that. I was kind of dealing with the shock, but there was something gnawing at me about this. And this chief turned to me and he said, "Yeah, in my experience, human beings just shouldn't die like that." Mm. Now, when he verbalized that was like just a lightning bolt into my soul. That was the boundary that I had experienced a crossing that day. Mm-hmm. And it was this sort of, underlying, again, value that a human being should not die like I had witnessed this person had died. He never knew that. I didn't tell him that, but it was deeply shaping to me. That's exactly what I'm trying to talk about, and that's why it's so subjective. I mean, moral injury. Let's be candid. Yeah. Moral injury is subjective, and that's one of the reasons it will probably never make it into the DSM Diagnostic and Statistical Manual level 6. I mean, it's not in DSM-5 now that categorizes disorders, because again, it's predicated on my own values, principles, attitudes, and beliefs. I may not even know what those are, mm-hmm. right? But I may go through a trauma in which something is profoundly shaped in that regard. And only after that trauma do I begin to understand what my own interior boundaries are in that regard. And again, now from the original clinical work, which was very, very important to delineate post-traumatic stress disorder from moral injury, one can have diagnosable PTSD and separately moral injury, right? Now, I've done some other writing also about the concept of spiritual injury, because one of my frustrations with the military, and I can say that, I hope, in a loving way, is one of the things I hear less and less of today in the contemporary profession of arms is a willingness to say something like General Marshall said in 1941 in a very famous speech: the soldier's heart, the soldier's soul is everything, right? And Marshall was talking about that it's the soul of the soldier that sustains him or her in combat and will lead them to either do their duty or falter at the critical moment in battle. But I hear less and less people in the profession of arms talking about soldiers having a soul. We want to talk about, mental health, which is very important, or we want to talk about moral injury, and that's a very abstract concept. But I firmly believe that also soldiers and every person has a soul, and that can be, maybe that's the locus of my moral injury. And so when we call it a soul injury, I'm willing to own that language, right? I'm willing to call it spiritual injury or soul injury as well. So I hear less and less of that in the profession of arms today, and that troubles me.
And yet, as a clinician, I feel like even when I'm teaching or talking with someone, what I feel like I'm interacting with a soul, first of all, but I can see the weariness in someone's soul. I can see the disappointment in someone's soul. And that's separate from the emotion of the moment, separate from the cognitive or mental anguish or lack thereof or happiness or whatever, right? There's just something different about soul injury. And I think that's what led me to do a lot of the most recent work, was the soul of people, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal. There was I've said it a million times, but I call COVID a psychological breaking point, because a physiological breaking point as well. Like it was just too much, but it actually, to me, was a false peak, because when the Afghanistan withdrawal happened, what I saw was a crash. And that's what I felt like was really a soul and moral injury. It was a different reaction.
Yes.
Compared to what people had experienced before.
So let me kind of feedback on that, because I absolutely concur with you, having led our Army unit ministry teams in Europe during COVID, right? I thought that was probably the worst communal experience I could have seen. And yet I think, again, in the profession of arms, the fall of Afghanistan was perhaps even worse in some ways. And I say that to say that experience in August and September of 2021, and by the way, I'm not making any political judgments here. I'm simply trying to describe what I, as a chaplain, saw amongst our students, staff, faculty, their families, right? That's my parish, if you will. I saw two things. Number one, this gravitation back toward Jonathan Shea's original language of betrayal. Right now, more recently, in the last 20 years or so, in terms of moral injury studies, you've heard more and more about the word transgression. But transgression, to me, frankly doesn't have the same sense of almost visceral punch. But betrayal, that when I used that word with our veterans who had served in Afghanistan, maybe even not Afghanistan, but Iraq, that was what they were feeling. That's what their families were feeling. By the way, that extended not only to American service personnel, but we had so many partner and allied nation personnel who had also served in Afghanistan. And they wondered, has America betrayed us? Because we were part of this fighting force as well, right? So from that experience, I saw the critical linkage between betrayal and trust. Right, you cannot maintain trust without understanding just how foundational betrayal is to relationships. And that's the other thing that I began to really see. And I had never thought about this before in terms of moral injury. Moral injury is, even though it's very subjective, right, in terms of me understanding it within myself, it always takes place in context of relationship. Mm-hmm. It may be my relationship to myself, but it could be my relationship to my unit. It could be my relationship to my family. It could be my relationship to my community. It could be my relationship to my nation. It could be my relationship to God, right? Any of those things are contexts of relationship. So do I understand if I'm grieving that I am feeling betrayed? Well, betrayal is always between, either, the person to the self or really to two other people, three other people. So who has betrayed whom?
So let me pause you right there.
Okay.
Because this is the complexity, I feel like, of the end of those 2 decades. Because
yes,
so many people, again, this is my assumption based off of talking to people and my assumption, but when that happened, right, there was a sense of betrayal. Mm-hmm. And yes, I know that there are some people that were ready to leave, that felt like it was time to leave, that maybe mm-hmm. didn't have as visceral of a reaction, and that's valid too.
Right.
But there was a significant number of people that felt that punch in the gut, that felt that visceral reaction, and had a very difficult time naming it. They knew they felt betrayed,
right?
But it lingers.
Yes,
it lingers. And as soon as you bring up that incident, you can feel the energy in the room shift. What's interesting about what you're bringing up is people have had a hard time naming what it was, other than a betrayal. Like, why am I having a hard time moving through this or processing it or healing from it? Mm-hmm. That lingering trauma that cannot be defined by post-traumatic stress.
Right.
That's other.
Yes. So you're exactly correct. And let's be candid that one of the effects of betrayal, if one feels betrayed by another, right, in any kind of relationship, that betrayal becomes paradigmatic for the rest of that relationship until it is surfaced at a conscious level between the two people, the one who feels betrayed and the one who betrayed, and reconciliation or restoration is attempted and achieved, right? Until that occurs, it remains. And that's one of the reasons in my writing, I have described moral and spiritual injury as pervasive and persistent. And what I mean by that is these types of injuries go to the core of my being, right? If this is embedded in my soul, because this person, these people, this organization has betrayed or even transgressed a closely held value on my part, that has ruptured that relationship. And until that relationship is restored, that becomes the condition of my framing of that relationship for the rest of my life, right? So it's pervasive to the core of my being. One can heal from PTSD. There are treatment modalities, and I've gone through some that have been very, very effective for dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. One can mitigate the effects of it. But moral injury and spiritual injury can be to the core of the being. That's why I say they're pervasive. And until they're addressed at a conscious level, they are persistent. They remain in longevity over time. You see this sometimes in family systems, right? A family who may come into my office for counseling in crisis, we might say, well, they're almost like a system, right? For instance, husband, wife, children, they're all related to one another. And then they're not there in the office, but in the background, and their stories are grandparents and aunts and uncles and extended family. It's a huge system. And it's amazing to me. It was always, when I first came into the Army, how sometimes you would have people sitting in my office in deep, deep pain, right? But living in relation to senses of betrayal that had gone back decades in their family systems, because the memories of those things are so powerful in our relationships. Well, in much the same way, I think moral and spiritual injury can occur in our case, in the profession of arms, and profoundly shape our reactions. And then if we don't have the concepts or the language to deal with them, that pain can almost metastasize and then become not only chronic, but perhaps even life-threatening if it leads to a further debilitation that might lead towards self-harm or suicidal ideation or at-risk behaviors, all kinds of things, right? These types of injuries, that's why I also say they're persistent. They just don't get better until they're addressed.
you talked about that relationships play a huge part in moral injuries. So on one hand, we had the incredible interview, which I know you haven't had a chance to hear yet, but with Andrew Rudd, who was described a very difficult experience of a father and his family. They came up to him and, knowing they were not going to get on the plane, asked him to kill him and his family. And that is a moral injury in relationship to humanity. Or what does it mean to take care of families? What does it mean to take care of people? What does it mean to rescue people? What does it mean from my values and my morals to save a human, to say no to that human and know what else is going to happen to that person in that family. So in that relationship, right in front of him, there was the moral injury was against his morals. And yet even saying no to that, was still just a horrific situation to be in. There was no good decision. Right.
So often, and this is one of the reasons, Corie, that, I'm a professor of ethics here at the War College, right? And this is one of the reasons I think moral injury is such a question of ethics, right? Because it's related to values, principles, attitudes, beliefs. In essence, to take the situation you're describing, an American soldier might be deployed, and in this situation, you are taught, okay, you're an agent of the state, you're sanctioned to defend the state or to use violence on behalf of the state, and the soldier might raise his or her right hand and agree to that, right? Okay, I've taken the oath, I'm going to do that. You find yourself in this situation, you're holding a weapon, you have the ability to inflict violence, but you know that your calling to do that on behalf of the nation is supposed to be for, in fact, beneficial purposes. And here now, in this very, very chaotic context, a plaintive, pleading father comes up and says, if we can't get on the plane, just kill us now. The soldier may not even consciously remember back to basic training or advanced individual training, the idea that I don't harm or kill non-combatants. But he may not remember that at a conscious level, but at a subconscious level, unconscious level, he knows, no, this is not an enemy fighter. This is a civilian. I'm supposed to be here to help civilians. I cannot do what this person wants. Knowing that you are consigning them to some kind of fate beyond that day, and you may never have resolution or closure on it, right? Yeah. So why is that a question of ethics? Well, one of the things that we say in ethical reasoning and reflection when we work with our students is some of the hardest ethical decisions are not right versus wrong decisions. Those are often very kind of clear cut. And you may do something that violates your beliefs and it's wrong. And okay, then you've created your own type of moral injury because you knew it was wrong to do that. Some of the hardest ethical decisions are ones where there are two competing rights. Yeah. Or three competing right decisions. And you're trying, particularly in chaotic circumstances, to think through and parse through what is the best outcome I can do here. What's almost the least bad thing I can do in this situation that is still considered a good decision, or I can live with it and call it a good decision. That's why this is very much a question of ethics.
Well, and you've studied this so much more than I, so this might be scrambling your words, but I even look at that encounter as a moral decision versus a soul decision. Can I say that?
Well, no,
because
that's
there's a right and wrong. Most soldiers are going to go, of course, I'm not going to kill a civilian.
Correct.
This is not a threat or whatever. But then the secondary soul experience of what is it? Is it crossing a boundary within me to send this family out knowing that they could be murdered or they could be harmed in some way?
Yes.
And I participated in making that decision that allowed that.
This is why Don Snyder, one of my mentors and a famous, he's a background in political science, former infantry officer, but also taught for many years at West Point and here at the War College. But Don has repeatedly said that the profession of arms is a moral profession because it involves moral decision making. Every decision you make is freighted with moral meaning. Right? Even if it's just there's one position into which you can promote people, but you have 5 people to assess and you have to select one over the other 4. That becomes a decision freighted with moral meaning, right? Mm-hmm. are you willing to own that, right? Are you willing to accept that responsibility, perhaps as a leader? So to your point, yes, it's very much a moral decision that soldier is making at that gate in that moment. But he may or she may be doing something that will wound their soul for years, even if they come to the point later where they're able to say, I still made the right decision. I could not, in good conscience, take that person's life or this family's life, but I still bear in me somewhere the woundedness that I created for myself by doing that. Perhaps not a sense of betrayal, but one has to parse through that, work through that. And I contend, again, at the best place to do that is at a conscious level. Oftentimes, these kinds of conflicts exist in our sort of, I think the best thing to do to achieve some sort of growth or healing is to move them from as I term it, from an implicit to an explicit level. I had somebody years ago tell me that the longest journey a human being will ever take is from their heart to their head. That there are so many things that I bear in my soul. Have I taken the time to reflect on those and to really understand myself and what is the locus of my injury here, if it's a true moral injury, and why is it a moral injury? And am I willing to examine whether I feel like I have betrayed another or I've been betrayed by another, or maybe it was simply not betrayal, but a sense that I crossed a boundary here. I transgressed a boundary that I had. And am I willing to live with that? How do I restore that? I mean, these are profound questions that really have to be dealt with at I think, again, an explicit level of human growth and understanding in order to live and achieve growth from. And that's one other thing I would say. Moral injury is again, pervasive and persistent, but it need not be permanent. I want to make sure your hearers understand that. And if betrayal has been involved in the breaking of relationship with one or other people, I can attempt to achieve restoration in that relationship and grow from it. There can, in fact, be post-traumatic growth. By the way, this is, I think, bounded not only about in terms of human relationships. Many of the soldiers that I've dealt with feel like they have betrayed God, right? They have often asked me, Chaplain, how can God forgive me if he knew what I had done, right? Now,
or didn't do.
Or didn't do.
Yeah.
And notwithstanding that, my belief is, well, God does know what that is. Yeah. But am I willing also to attempt restoration with God? I think God is perfectly willing to accept us coming forward with that. And so in my class this morning, we were talking about post-traumatic growth, and we were talking about not only restoration of relationships in a human context, but perhaps even in an existential context. Am I willing to go and confess and perhaps even receive absolution and forgiveness for that? That is a powerful mechanism for healing as well. I've met many soldiers who didn't feel unburdened about their moral injury until they went to that attempt to explicitly deal with that existential relationship with God, however they frame that relationship with God.
So that example of that particular soldier being on the ground, dealing with humanity in such a chaotic situation is definitely multi-layered and complex in what they went through. We have a lot of other people that felt helpless, that felt on the outside. I know we have, Scott Mann and so many other veterans and civilians too, found their own ways to Afghanistan to figure out how to address what they were feeling initially was a sense of betrayal, a sense of maybe I won't use the words and you can use them better, but like being stuck in a place of making a choice of doing something or not doing something. And what could they live with themselves in that choice? And so many of them figured out ways to get on a plane and go and do something to say that they could in the absence of help being there for some of the allies. So there is another group of people that experienced what feels very much to them like a betrayal. And I don't know if you would define that as a betrayal of relationship with the institution or whether it's with, the nation, as you described, maybe all of them.
Yeah.
So would you mind sharing, you were here at the War College, like what was some of the wrestling that you saw? How would you describe or define the moral injury from that event?
Well, one of the ways that I saw it manifested profoundly during that time was in the families of our students who were in class, and many of them voiced to their students and to me the fact that, let's say, a wife and children are at home and their husband is here in the class as a student, maybe deployed to Afghanistan several times. I had Marines, I had Air Force, I had Navy, I had Army that said this exact same thing. How profoundly those families felt betrayed because they had invested in their warriors' entire profession, right? 15, 20 years of service to the nation. And through one of these services, they felt betrayed, right? That they had given something as a family. They had poured their blood, sweat, and treasure into all the PCSs, the moving changes, the sending their soldier off to deployment and an unknown fate, maybe even getting in, firefights, coming back physically wounded, certainly coming back morally and spiritually wounded, if not psychologically wounded. They felt betrayed. So the extension of this type of injury to family systems was something that I think played out profoundly here. You touched on how that then also another concentric circle just beyond that is the sense that also perhaps not only has the profession or question has the profession betrayed us, but has the nation betrayed us? Can we really trust our own government? And the sense of frustration with that. And the impetus to do something in response, and that in itself is a proper motive, can be a proper motivation. But when you don't have an outlet to do something, how do you reconcile that? Because in this day and age of instant communication, where I am watching what's happening on the tarmac at Hamid Karzai Airport or Abbey Gate, right? I feel my own sense of anger. It's like the war has been brought into my living room. Maybe even I know somebody there, or I have a family member who's there. I want to do something, but I can't. Right? That sense of frustration as well. That can almost feed that sense of feeling betrayed by the nation. Why did the nation put my loved one, us, in this context to have to deal with this, to live with this? In essence, one of the things military families know is kind of a truism that I've used for years. The soldier leaves the battlefield, but the battlefield never leaves the soldier, right? And those things get internalized within the family system over years, can become powerful, powerful drivers. Anyway, what also became apparent to me, again, here at our context, we have a lot of students who are from allied and partner nations, was this experience was not confined only to American service personnel. Mm-hmm. We had a number of, frankly, men and women who had gone to Afghanistan with us, who had spent their own time there, who had done their own deployments from their nations in partnership with us, and they were profoundly angry about this, and felt their own sense of betrayal. And their own questioning about whether they could trust not us, as fellow service members and families, but whether they could trust the American profession of arms or the American nation. I'm not sure, frankly, that we've continued or we've ever really resolved that rupture, right? We try to in different ways here in our individual relationships, but at the national level, I'm concerned that we've never really addressed that.
Well, and I definitely want you to address on reconciliation and the importance of, I was using the word reconstitution. How do you reconstitute? But I think that it's a lot more about how do you recover? How do you tend to those wounds relationally is so important. and define what is this relationship that I'm going to have with the institution? What is the relationship, my family, that we are willing to have with the institution? What you're saying is that important in all of this must be reconciliation of the relationship if it's going to be restored.
That's absolutely correct. I believe that is categorically needed to recover from moral injury or spiritual injury. But this is one of the things that is so hard.
It is, because you cannot control the relationship.
Precisely. And if it's a sense that the nation, and when we say the nation, sometimes people will say the army, well, it's a big army. Usually they're thinking about people in a certain kind of command relationship. But if I say the nation betrayed us, how do I achieve reconciliation with that? Right. Who am I going to go to? It's not like I can go to my representative or my senator. I can't.
And when is it enough?
Yes, precisely.
You could have 10 people that start to restore it, but how do you define when it's enough?
Right. Precisely. This is one of the reasons I think it's absolutely vital on the part of nation states or people groups to, at the strategic level, to then take ownership of creating the conditions for that relationship with individuals, families, communities, organizations like the military to be restored. I'll give you a perfect example. When the nation of South Africa was coming out of apartheid, right? Apartheid as a political system was dying. And it was very clear that Nelson Mandela was going to be released from prison, and South Africa was going to go into a new phase of its future, its life as a nation. Both Mandela and Bishop Desmond Tutu worked very, very consciously and with a strategic framework to allow people who felt that the nation had betrayed them to have a venue for seeking restoration. And in fact, what they set up was a series of what were called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where people who had grievances against, let's say, a local police force or some sort of constabulary, they would actually bring the people who were accusing and the accused into the same courtroom and context. And they wouldn't try to parse out legal justice. Okay, you're now sentenced to so many years. They would simply try to surface the claim of the brokenness of that relationship and basically to state the truth and to create the conditions for reconciliation to occur. And many observers many political observers of South Africa said that effort on their part at the strategic level for South Africa by Mandela, by Tutu, by others of good conscience in that nation probably saved that nation from devolving into, frankly, internecine war and chaos.
By giving voice, by allowing truth, by creating a safe place for people to have that conversation. Correct. And the strategy for how that relationship could mend.
That's absolutely correct. But that had to come from the national level. The state had to understand we have a crisis on our hands that affects the entire body politic, but they don't have the ability to seek restoration of the relationship with us. We have to create the conditions for that to occur. It's one of the problems about how do you end a conflict, right? In one sense, apartheid was a type of political conflict, not a military conflict. But how do you come home from war? How do you come home from conflict? America faced this after the American Civil War in 1865. How do we reconcile with these two deeply divided sets of peoples in the North and the South? How do we achieve reconciliation and move forward as a nation? We're still as a nation struggling with that, right? The residual effects of that hundreds of years later is not easy to do.
I feel like as a young nation, we learned the pattern, the unhealthy coping mechanism and pattern of waiting it out.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that you can't do when a relationship has been ruptured. It simply is not going to you're not going to have restoration until it's attended to. And by the way, I think one of the other things we're not very good at in America is we generally we have a very short time horizon. We want things done quickly, or we want to medicate them away, or we want some sort of quick and easy solution. And yet some of these problems defy quick and easy solutions, and they take hard work. Relationships take hard work. They don't get better with time, and just by not attending to them, they simply will continue to fester and maybe even metastasize.
So, I know that you don't have like all the solutions here for the nation and for the world and for, but there are different kinds of people that are listening right now, right? So maybe we talk kind of from the top down.
Sure.
But like for those that are maybe in the top levels of government that are making decisions that, I was talking with the DoD family policy yesterday, and they asked me the question, how do we message, let's say even the results of a survey that says we're trying to mend and deal with like, what's the data and what's our solution for it? But we tend to not only release that data when it's confirmed and finished. And of course, their question was, how do we do that when people are asking for transparency and we don't often give that information until it's final? Of course, my answer was communicate something.
Yeah.
Anything, right? But we can't communicate silence. And so for those that are listening on maybe those government levels that are trying to learn, what does transparency look like? What does reconciliation look like? How do we model that in a way that can start the ball rolling towards healing? What would you say are a couple of things that the institution or the nation could do? Because I love this story and this model of that entity leading out in the restoration attempt.
I think the first step is for, frankly, leaders to lead. So that may seem facile and very simple, but it takes moral courage to step forward and propose a solution and then seek to enact that solution, particularly across large, complex organizations like, let's say, the United States government, or even some of the sub-departments of the Department of Defense, Interior, Justice, things like that. But a nation has got to have the moral imperative to want to recognize that there's a rupture in trust with its people. And then the nation has to take the steps to create the conditions where that can be restored. But that begins with the moral courage in individual leaders to step forward and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. In essence, would South Africa have ever achieved what it did without Bishop Tutu and President Mandela? Likely not, right? But they put their personal capital behind that as leaders, and we revere them, right, as tremendously impactful moral leaders. Dr. Martin Luther King did the same thing in terms of putting his call for racial justice and equality in this nation front and center as a part of his public theology, right? But it took political leaders saying, yes, this is right. We're going to set the conditions to do this. I think my concern is, Corie, that one of the things that has not changed since 2021 is a profound rupture in the trust between the American people and the body politic about its profession of arms. And I don't see that getting better until the nation state takes the steps to address that and to create the conditions where people can come forward and seek, voice their pain and seek some type of reconciliation or restitution. What form might that take? I have no idea. I really don't. By the way, other nations have struggled with these same kinds of issues. Post-war Germany in 1945 had to basically take ownership with its own people of what the National Socialist regime had done to not only to Germany but also to Europe and the world since 1933 for 12 years. and somehow build a new nation and forge new bonds of trust out of that.
By embracing some level of
correct.
Participation.
Exactly. And by giving people in the body politic a reason, right, and a possibility to trust again, and maybe even to own what they had done in terms of their not standing up to the National Socialists when they had seized power in 1933. Again, other nations have had to do this. I think at some point we need some type of leadership that is willing to own this breakage of trust and seek to restore it. Or I am concerned about whether the American profession of arms can continue to recover from that, and maybe even our allies and partner nations as well.
Well, and I think that begins with communicating and being able to start
Correct.
saying some things out loud, for
Yep.
sure. Knowing that changing the institution is one thing, but really this comes down to people, and you're bringing up relationships, and there is the person that's listening right now that feels that lingering, unresolved moral injury and is really looking to find that reconciliation in the relationships around them. How do people begin to heal some of those? What does relational reconciliation look for people on the ground level?
I think one of the things that's got to occur when two people, let's say, two friends, have somehow suffered some sort of friction in their relationship and things have devolved to the point that they're not speaking with one another. I think it begins with one of those people being willing to address the other and say, wait a minute, we had an important and life-giving relationship that was generative for both of us. Somehow that has been moved off to the periphery and we've lost that. We need to restore that. And I want to try and explore what happened with you. Again, maybe restore perspective. And if I have wronged you, I want to be able to know what that is so that I can own that and seek reconciliation with you and to restore our relationship, right? It takes at least one, if not both of the people to do that. Husbands and wives, for instance, do this all the time in successful marriages, right? Friends have to do the same thing. I think in some sense, we have to do that as well at the individual level. I always, as a chaplain, right, and as a civilian clergy member, I'm also a pastor. I think that a great place to do that is with one's relationship with God. I tell people God has pretty big shoulders. So if you're angry at God, he can take that, but go to God in the same kind of vein. God, somehow something has happened in my relationship with you, and I am frustrated, I'm angry, I'm hurt. I feel like maybe, God, you betrayed me, right? I need to lay this before you and seek some sort of reconciliation. And I need our relationship to be restored. I want to go back, however. So I think it takes basic ownership at the individual level, right? But I want to go back to this national,
Please,
because something came to mind as we were sitting here talking.
Because I feel like people understand reconciliation on a human relational level.
Right.
What we're struggling with now is this national institutional level.
That's
where
right.
How do you move forward?
Well, so here's an idea, right? In the United States Army, and by the way, in the Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Space Force now, when one of the people in our ranks falls, dies by natural death, killed in combat, whatever, we stop and we gather the formation and the unit and we hold a memorial service or a ceremony, right? The command is present. Everyone focuses on that. All the resources of the unit go toward honoring that person who was in our ranks and midst and has now departed. And we want to not only celebrate their life, but honor their service and honor their memory and grieve, right? I wonder if at some level, something like a national memorial service is not in order for America. Perhaps, again, at a strategic level where we, in a simple, direct memorial service of 30, 45, 60 minutes, pause as a people and as a government to memorialize those who fell in Iraq or Afghanistan serving this nation and their family members and all those who were wounded. And we, because those, one of my experiences as an Army chaplain is, it's amazing. The hardest, most hardened soldiers will go to those ceremonies, and it's as if when they hear the strains of Amazing Grace, or a bagpipe played, or the 23rd Psalm beginning to be read, it will just act as a cathartic permission to grieve.
Yeah.
And one thing I think we have not done.
Skipped over that.
Correct. As a nation, we never allowed not only our service members and their families to grieve, we haven't allowed the nation to grieve. And I wonder if that could be helpful for America to reach a sense of closure about these wars, to honor the sacrifice of those who did, but then hopefully out of the wake of that, to begin reestablishing trust in our profession of arms and in our body politic.
I think that was a big part of the betrayal, was that there was no pause.
Yes.
There was no rest. There was no conversation. There was no opportunity to grieve in a formal way. I think we ended things and we said, good job for those that helped us end that. And that was really tough, but now we're going to set our sights on something different. And I think people were in a very desperate place of need to acknowledge what everybody went through. And when we shifted our attention, understandably so, to these other threats, there was no opportunity to acknowledge. And I know that boots on the ground, there are still many service members that still feel like what happened in Afghanistan, that there's still people that need to be acknowledged.
Yes.
And yet the whole cohort wasn't acknowledged either. Just, there wasn't even a thank you for, it felt like, and no national thank you, no anything. And so I think that, I wonder, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I wonder if that was the bigger betrayal of all of it. Maybe perhaps there was different groups that were okay with the chaos of, all the strategic, elements that we're going through and how that ended. Definitely not the way that we wanted to end. There is that betrayal of what do we do with our allies, but for your own nation,
right,
to not acknowledge, that was hurtful.
It was, and by the way, in our class, one of the things we've explored is the fact that when America moved to the all-volunteer force in 1973, which, by the way, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have moved to the all-volunteer force. Prior to that, we were conscript and militia-based armies. But the reality is, prior to 1973, many of our units that were sent to fight on behalf of the nation had ties, direct ties, to communities and to states. And after 1973, we created this very, very tactically and technically proficient fighting force that could go and fight on our behalf, but was often sort of segregated or maybe even discreetly separated from the very people we were meant to go and serve, or on whose behalf we went to serve. Well, something is lost not only for those soldiers and or those warriors and their families, something's lost for the nation when that occurs. Yeah. And I think in some sense, something like a national memorial ceremony, when people can dial, even if they can't physically be present there, it's their memorial ceremony as well. Even if they can only dial in and listen in, the sounds, the sights, it becomes a focal point for the nation to memorialize, to honor, to remember, and then to try and heal and move forward. Whether we did that or something else, I think America has got to really do some soul searching about the contemporary profession of arms and what kind of relationship the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and Guardians that we have today, who are great, great people, and their families are great, but we often serve with almost no touch points back to the very nation that we represent. And that the nation has got to help us overcome. We've got to do that, I think, to move forward and maybe even move past our own national moral injury.
I truly believe that one of the greatest challenges we have ahead of us is the reconciliation of our nation's warfighters with the nation itself. Until we do so, the moral injury from both Vietnam and Afghanistan will continue to fester, pulling our communities farther and farther apart. Yet while it seems there is too much water under the bridge, or that the task is too immense, there are examples of other nations that we can learn from as they have attempted the healing process themselves. Archbishop Tutu, whom Dr. Mallard mentioned for his leadership of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, is a fascinating study of the painful, messy, but powerful process of rebuilding a nation. The commission is worth studying as they created a 4-part strategy to help South Africans with the intense generational betrayal experienced at the hands of the government. Number 1, those who had committed wrongdoing had to admit and acknowledge the harm done. Number 2, both sides needed to tell their story and be a witness to the anguish. 3, perpetrators asked for forgiveness, and those hurt, hopefully, could grant it. And 4, people were invited to renew or release the relationship. Years later, in reflection, here is what Tutu had to share about what he witnessed from his time in the commission. Perhaps his words will be a balm to the injuries to your soul and will ease you into the next step of your own forgiveness journey.
There was a massacre that happened when soldiers shot, I don't know how many people, and we were going to have a hearing to investigate what had happened. And the hall was packed to the rafters with people who had been injured there, people who had lost loved ones on that incident. And the soldiers came in. The tension in the room was palpable. You could cut it with a knife. And they walk in, and the white officer is a spokesperson of this group. And he says, yes, we gave the instructions for the soldiers to open fire. The temperature in the room rose several degrees. And then he turned and said, please forgive us. And that angry crowd did something that none of us could have predicted. They broke out in wild applause. And when the applause had subsided, I said to all of us, I was presiding on that occasion, I said, let us keep quiet, because really we are in the presence of something holy. We ought to take off our shoes, because we are standing on holy ground. You can't make anybody forgive another. And yet, when that occurs, it is like saying, I give you another opportunity. To forgive is to say, I give you another chance to make a new beginning. Forgiving is never easy. It's not cheap. For us Christians, it cost God the death of God's Son. It isn't anything that you can demand of others. But when it has happened, it has an incredible capacity to change a situation.
The Military Culture Shift podcast is sponsored by New Res and written and produced by me, author, speaker, and military clinical consultant Corie Weathers. This is a supplemental leadership podcast for the book Military Culture Shift, The Impact of War, Money, and Generational Perspective on Morale, Retention, and Leadership. Copies of the book can be purchased on Amazon, militaryfamilybooks.com, and your other favorite retailers. More information, including graphs, data, and other resources mentioned in the book, can be found on my website, corieweathers.com.